Hey everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in to Cognitive Psychology, chapter number 13. It's me and my boy Fozzie, who, as you can see, is just now laying down. He was just sitting up and staring at the wall for some reason, and then once I started talking, then he just kind of like, alright, I know that Dad is going to be talking for the next 90 minutes or so I'm just going to chill out and listen. So maybe you're doing the same. Thank you so much for being here. This is the final chapter of our class, so thank you so much for making it all the way to the end. This is, as I've mentioned, the first time I've recorded these videos since I put together this textbook. So I hope that the textbook was readable. I hope that it was somewhat engaging and not too dense. And I hope that you didn't notice all the stuff that I cut out. So cognitive psychology is a huge field. It's been around since the 50s, and there are so many areas that cognitive psychology has studied and been involved with. There's like so much neuroimaging stuff that I did not include here because I was too worried about getting lost in the weeds on that. I also didn't cover the visual knowledge kind of chapter of content or the mental rotation chapter of content. Some cognitive psychology textbooks have chapters just for that stuff, but honestly, I find that stuff really boring, and I didn't want to cover it, so that's why I didn't. Let's get into it. We're talking about consciousness. I have a little bit of a kind of a conflicting relationship with this chapter because consciousness is a huge problem. It is a conundrum. It is a riddle. It is something that scientists aren't really able to figure out. We're getting, we're making progress, but usually you'll have, especially people in the like Silicon Valley tech world, will like kind of talk about like how like they're decoding the brain and that they have like all these implants and chips and stuff that allow us to do stuff. And maybe some of the stuff maybe we can, but we are still so far away from really kind of understanding exactly how consciousness works from day to day, and that means that there is a lot of things that we don't know, which makes this chapter kind of difficult to wrestle with because there is still so much that we don't know. But that's okay. It's okay to be humbled. It's okay to say that you don't know. It's okay to say that you don't know, but maybe one day that we will. And I think that that's kind of how we are with a lot of these questions that we're going to be talking about. We may not know these things yet, but we made progress and that we'll get there eventually. It's just not here yet. So that's one thing that's kind of what I'm a little bit frustrated with this chapter. But on the other hand, I really love this chapter because it kind of lets us think about some of the big questions about what it means to be you and what it means to interact with other people and whether or not the you right now watching this is the same you that maybe 10 years from now might return to this video, or 10 years before now was singing Taylor Swift songs at the top of your lungs, standing on top of your bed whenever your mom and dad decided they were going to drive down the road 10 minutes to go pick up your sister from soccer practice. You wouldn't do that now, right? Does that mean you're a different person? What does that mean about your consciousness? Let's take a quick tour through the world of consciousness. I got some videos for you here. The ones that I want to really kind of emphasize, though, because we're going to be watching this one together. This one right here is some really, really old footage, so I don't even want to show it on this stream because it's just going to be hard to even look at because you're looking at a recording of a recording of a recording. But it is a really cool example of an individual who has blind sight. We're going to talk about that a little bit later today, but basically blind sight is your eyes, totally fine, they work. They're healthy. There's nothing wrong with them. But something in your brain has short-circuited. There's some lesion, usually in your occipital lobe, that is going to create a disconnect where you are not consciously aware of what you see. So you have people who are blind. All of their eyes are totally fine. And so in this video, you're going to see a man walk down a hallway and cleverly avoid all of these obstacles that are in his path. Now, the interesting thing is that man is legally blind. And that if you asked him, why did you step out of the way of this? He would tell you that he doesn't know why he did. So he's away. Well, he's reacting to the visual world. He's just not aware of it. What a weird thing, right? So let's take a quick look at the weird world of consciousness. And I wanted to start out here by kind of talking a little bit about how much we don't know. So in the mid-2010s, so not that long ago, and this is primarily because of social media, to be honest with you. I've complained a lot about social media. This is one of the really cool examples of how it can bring people together and not divide them. But in this, in there was one summer, and this happened on Twitter, where somebody posted a thought exercise where they said, like, essentially, close your eyes and imagine a red apple, and then choose which of the following you saw in your mind's eye. So go ahead and do that. Think to yourself, or actually, instead of an apple, think about it as a square, because that'll work with the slide that I'm going to show right here on the right. So close your eyes and think of a red square, okay? So in your head, imagine that red square, imagine the color, imagine the points on that square, roughly how big it is. I just want you to imagine it. The interesting thing is that this is not something that you can open up your eyes now. This is not something that everybody can do. And so whenever you close your eyes, some of you probably imagine something like this, 6, so a big, bright, saturated red. Some of you may have saw this in your mind's eye. So maybe it was kind of a square but didn't have color, or for some of you, it was nothing at all, right? And we've kind of brushed up against these ideas a little bit already this semester, because we've been talking about, what is it actually that the brain is kind of communicating? Is it communicating in language, or is it communicating in visuals? And we talked about this with Stephen Wiltshire, in previous chapters. We talked about it when we were talking about Delos Wickens, and how in chapter 9, and about how the brain typically is going to encode things as language because it's more efficient. It's easy to encode things as language instead of as the visual high fidelity elements of it. And that's how we started talking about Stephen Wiltshire, right? So part of this is to show, number one, that we are all different, that just because you might see, like for me, it's probably closer to 5. Like that's what I see whenever I close my eyes and picture like a red square. I don't really see it all that vibrant. It's almost like it's in the dark almost. And so it's, kind of a muted color here, but it still do have the form, still do have the color, but that's not the same as everybody. And that's really, really interesting. And it's also really interesting because how do you know I'm telling the truth? How do I know that you're telling the truth? How do you know that I am accurate in my retelling of what I am experiencing? This brings us back to some of the earliest issues with psychology, right? When we were talking about introspection in chapter 1, and about how behaviorists didn't like that you could just kind of answer, here's what I'm experiencing, and that's not really a scientific way of measurement, right? That you can't really verify that. You can't really measure that empirically. And so as we walk through this chapter, you're going to see this a lot. You're going to see a lot of, well, how do we actually test this kind of thing? How can we test it? How can we make it empirical? And isn't it cool how we've already made so many connections to the previous chapters? You're going to see that throughout so much of this chapter, where we're going to be calling back to previous things. Because now that we're talking about consciousness, which I think of as kind of super hierarchical, which means that it's kind of on top of everything else. You have memory, you have attention, you have decision making. You can have all of those things without having consciousness. And so now we're looking at how consciousness kind of taps into all of those things. What I'm referring to here is called qualia. So qualia is a subjective experience that you have, and it's an internal one. So it is maybe you are imagining a square, or maybe you are imagining a rainbow. Maybe you are imagining if I ask you to imagine a set of headphones, right? So I can't be sure that the same set of headphones that you are imagining are the same ones that I am imagining, right? Maybe you thought of something like this, like some pretty typical studio headphones. But maybe you were thinking of something more like this, like earbuds, right? I can't verify what it is that you are thinking unless I ask you. But even beyond that, it gets even more difficult because I can't verify then what it is that you are experiencing internally without asking you, without having to find some clever way for you to demonstrate what it is that you're experiencing. And so if you imagine the rainbow, and this is kind of a fun, very classic philosophical exercise. If you imagine the rainbow, you might imagine it looking like this. How do I know that the red that you see in your rainbow is the same red that I see in my rainbow. And if you've ever read that book in middle school, The Giver, I feel like that's whenever I read it. I think probably whenever you read it as well. It's written by somebody named Louis something. I don't remember the rest, and I can't be bothered to look it up. You can look it up if you want to on your own time. But that's a you thing. I'm already moving on. But if you read that book, then you may think a little bit about like, well, what does it mean to experience color differently than somebody else? Really fun book. But in this case, if I'm thinking about the color red, how do I know that, for example, you might see this color and call it blue, and I might see this color and also call it blue, but what I might be experiencing whenever I look at this guitar pick, which is a callback from a previous chapter, right, is that maybe I am seeing it as something closer to this color and you're seeing it as something closer to this color. So, but because I've always called this color of the rainbow red, and you've always called this color of the rainbow red, for example, I might not be sure that you're actually experiencing the same color that I am, even though you tell me that you are. So you can see how difficult this is, and there are lots of ways that we've tried to overcome this, because this is the issue of the black box all over again, except this is just a little bit harder. So we can try to come up with really clever experimental methodologies, which usually involve, in the case of synesthesia, if you remember that from previous chapters, where people will pair up colors with letters, as one example, like, or numbers. Whenever you see the number 4, it sticks out to you as red. How do you make sure that somebody's not lying about that? Well, you could give them a test and ask them to label it, and then 6 months later or 6 weeks later, surprise them with the same test. And if their results are different, then you know that something's weird. They might be making something up, or they might not be reliable. But if it is consistent, then that is, in support of this. But again, if you're skeptical like me, you're like, I don't know. There's still can't be quite 100% sure. So go through this chapter thinking skeptically, because I think we all should be with this stuff, with all the claims that are made about consciousness. So let's begin by talking about what consciousness is. Consciousness, and this really depends on who you ask on what consciousness is, because for some people it's very metaphysical. For some people, consciousness involves a soul or a spirit or something like that. For the purposes of this class, we're going to be avoiding all of that. And it's not because I or other cognitive psychologists don't believe in souls or spirits. I know you think that we are all godless heathens or whatever, but it's merely because, like, I know plenty of people who are like, one of my best friends, she is very religiously devout, but when it comes to work stuff, she's very much like, well, this is work stuff, and so, like, for her, she does believe in, like, a soul and a spirit, but for her, it's like, well, but when I'm looking at brain scans, I don't see a soul or spirit here, I'm just looking at consciousness, so you can believe whatever you want to believe, I guess is what I'm saying, is that, like, if you want to believe that, part of who you are is part of your consciousness, and that who you are is something metaphysical and supernatural and spiritual, that's totally cool. I don't see that as incompatible with this. I just see it as unrelated to what we're talking about here. I don't know if that makes anybody feel more or less uncomfortable, but that's just how I see it. At least in terms of the definitions that we're going to be using, consciousness is a form of awareness. So if you are hyper-aware, then you would be extremely conscious, you'd be extremely conscious of something. If you are unaware of something, then you are less conscious of it, right? So we're going to be looking at that dynamic and how consciousness is not something that is either on or off, but something that varies over time and across contexts. So with consciousness, we can think about things, right? So we can reflect on ideas. We can think about how your socks feel. You can think about how the tag on the back of your shirt feels. You can think about abstract ideas. Like, you can think about what the word crunchy means, So, like, what does it mean for something to be crunchy? You can think about these kind of abstract things even if they aren't directly in front of you, right? So consciousness allows us to do that. It also allows us to be able to communicate our own internal states, so we can tell, like, other people, like, yes, I am aware of that, without, like, Because otherwise, how do you do that? You have to like maybe rely on eye contact, maybe, and body language. But also, consciousness allows us to kind of vicariously experience other people's experiences too. What do I mean by that? I just mean that, like, for example, if you go to like a restaurant and you order something and it's really really slow, because it's packed there, it's like rush hour, there's like a field trip there, the restaurant's just a madhouse, and it's like really really slow and really busy, and a customer gets mad and they start yelling at one of the crew because the crew member made a mistake, and in that moment you're feeling bad, right? Not just because you're a little bit grumpy, but you're like, man, this sucks because that person didn't get their food right and they were waiting a really long time and they probably got places they need to go. But I also feel really bad for the person behind the counter who's getting yelled at, because it's not really their fault, because they're just really just busy and it's just a job, They don't really get paid to deal with this kind of attitude. And so consciousness, that awareness, allows you to kind of put yourself in the shoes of those individuals and kind of get a feel for like, oh, that, my heart goes out to them. I know that sucks. Or like whenever in my research methods class a couple of years ago, I had a student who won the freaking lottery. She won the lottery. I didn't get a dime of it though. I was gonna say her name as a joke and be like, yeah, I haven't forgot about that, but I don't want to dox her because I don't think she told all that many people. But she was like really happy one day and like, yeah, I bought a truck. And I was like, cool. And she was like, yeah, I bought it cash. And I was like, what do you mean you bought it cash? And she was like, because I won the lottery. Don't tell anybody. But I was super excited for her. Not because it was going to affect me in any way, but because I was like, oh, I know, I can have an idea what that might feel like. I can imagine things. And so consciousness involves so many different pieces of this. And it allows us to evaluate things, it allows us to help communicate, and it also allows us to essentially empathize, to put ourselves in other people's shoes. So what's happening below consciousness is quite interesting, because we have lots of behaviors that we deal with all the time without being aware of them, right? So if consciousness is something to do with our awareness, there are lots of things that we are not aware of. A lot of things we've been talking about this semester as well. Shout out to chapter 6 and 7 when we talk about implicit memory, for example. Implicit memory is memory for things you can't really put into words, right? So if I ask you, how do you tie your shoe, you may not be able to tell me, verbally how to tie your shoe, but you can show me how, right? And so to some degree, that shows an example of a behavior that doesn't require awareness. You can tie your shoe without actually thinking about it, right? And we see that that is true for some elements of priming as well, where like for word stem completion tasks, thinking again back to those memory chapters, where we might not have been aware that we knew the words, but then when we saw the word stem completion task, where we saw the word stems of like M-O-T-S-U-P, right? You're like, oh yeah, that's moth and that's supreme, right? So you knew that information, but it was under your awareness. You were not aware of it, which means that it was below your consciousness. So, and especially in the early chapters, when we were talking about attention, when we were talking about like the cocktail party effect, when we were talking about object recognition and visual perception, so many of those really basic cognitive processes happen without us being aware of them. As somebody else way smarter than me put it, whenever they would talk about cognitive psychology, they would talk a lot about how cognitive psychology is interesting because we know a lot about the products of our cognition. So we know a lot about what we think about, but we don't know about the operations of those processes. So we know the products of the processes, but not actually what those processes are, because a lot of them are below our level of consciousness. We're not aware of what's going on when we are recognizing a set of geons, right? Our brain just puts it together without us being aware of it. When we are solving the binding problem between the what stream of, the where stream of information and the what stream of information, we're doing that below consciousness. So I'm using this phrase like below consciousness and not the word subconscious here, because subconscious is a little too Freudian, because subconscious basically is kind of like the interpretation from Freud and still from a lot of psychodynamic folks who are just frankly wrong about a lot of things. Sorry, I could not help myself. We're at the end of the semester. I got to cut loose, y'all. But whenever they're talking about consciousness, they usually mean this as like consciousness almost has a mind of its own, where with like repression, like we talked about in chapter 8, that your consciousness is like, wait, that's a really scary thing. I'm going to hide this from my awareness, right? So it's subconscious in that way, or this subliminal in some way. That's not really what we mean here. We just mostly mean that we're just not aware of it, that it has some impact on us, but that we are not aware of it. That's all that we mean. There's no fancy magic, no kind of, like secret tunnels in the brain, where this is happening. It's not like some kind of loophole or anything like this. This is just stuff that we are aware of the products of it, but we're not necessarily aware of the processes that allow those things to happen. Here is an example of the different states of consciousness. So right now, hopefully, you are right here. You are awake. You are aware. You are conscious. Awesome. Congratulations. You made it. But this is not going to be true throughout the day. We're going to, for me, right around 3 p.m., I start moving into drowsy territory. And then kind of after dinner, then I pop back over to consciousness, unless I had like pot roast or a really heavy meal, and then I'm moving right back down into straight up deep sleep. But you can see here that throughout the day that we are going to be kind of moving back and forth between deep sleep and wakefulness, and that changes a little bit. And we might have a detour to go over here to be dreaming, or if we're having like REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, we might be kind of either sleepwalking or kind of having what's called the myoclonic jerks. Have you ever heard? That's a great band name, by the way, the myoclonic jerks. I've always had a great thought that if I had a band, I would call it myoclonic jerks. But I do have a band, and I probably mentioned it to you now, but because in the semester I'm going to shout it out, that our band is called Joe, but it's spelled this French way like this, Jeaux. It is me and 2 other professors in the psychology department. How fun is that? Sometimes we play shows around town, so follow us on Instagram if you want to see more weird psychology stuff. But this time us playing music. Here we have, so we are talking about the myoclonic jerks. That's where we have movement, right? We have, looks like some behavior, but it's below our conscious awareness. So to interpret this graph, what we're looking at right here on the y-axis is how clear is that content. So obviously when you are dreaming, you might be, it feels like you're aware of this stuff. Like you can see it, you can experience it, you can react to it. Whereas like with sleepwalking, you're not perceiving any of that stuff. Generally, I was a really bad sleepwalker for a long time. And the next day, people would ask if I remembered anything about sleepwalking, and I never would. Whereas with dreaming, sometimes we do remember dreams, right? As we get less aroused and less clear in our content, we get to general anesthesia. So general anesthesia is generally even deeper than deep sleep. And then beyond that, we have coma, and then beyond that, we have brain death, where you essentially no longer have your frontal cortex, where that has been atrophied away, and any kind of resemblance of like a personality or knowledge base is gone. It's extremely sad, very scary to think about. But so as you can see here, that this is something that can change throughout the day. It can also change throughout our life, where sometimes that people feel, sometimes of their life where they just feel a little bit more high energy versus other times, which would be like maybe down here. There are other times where you might feel maybe a little bit more imaginative and things are a little bit more clear. So maybe you're up here, and then other times you get a little bit of brain fog, and so maybe you're like right around there. The point being that consciousness is not just some one thing that you turn on or off, but that it changes throughout our lifetime and also throughout the day. So a couple of looks here at different brainwave frequencies. We're looking at this usually through oscilloscopes and EEG, so electroencephalography. So we're looking at, these are spindle waves, so we're actually looking at the electrical activation of the brain. So I thought this was fun to look at as we're talking about states of consciousness. So looking at like right now, if you are focusing on this video and you're learning, and I threw on one of those cool EEG caps on your head to measure what's going on, you can see this is probably what I would be seeing if I was looking at something on your cortex. So really high frequency, right, where it looks really, really scribbly. If I slow down a little bit, So if I am, to refer back to this image right here, if I'm sliding down a little bit this direction, I'm getting a little bit drowsy now, so I'm not as concentrating, I'm just kind of awake. You can see here that we still have a lot of scribbly, right? It's still high frequency, but that those wave peaks are a little bit further away from each other. So the frequency is starting to decrease. And then whenever we get sleepy, when we get all tie-tie, right, we can see that it slows down even more. And then when we are in light sleep, you can see it slow down even more. And then when we are in deep sleep, it slows down even more. Okay, so we can look at, and so one of the things that I really like about this figure is that you don't see, for example, how like during one of these states of consciousness, how our brainwaves go like from this to this to this, like, you know, we don't have any waves that really look like that, nor do we have waves that look like that or anything like that. You know, so basically what I'm trying to say is that this is not categorical. That this is something, it's not like we're in this mode and then we're in this mode. That this is a spectrum. That this is something that changes by degrees. So, you know, what I have here are kind of like 5 different kind of looks into awareness or consciousness, but these are not exactly states. So it's not like you can have like a concentrating state and then an activity state and then a relaxation state, but that we can kind of slide in and out. And there might be some times where like you're in the classroom and you move from here to here to here, right? So it's not like you're on one for 1 hour and then you're on another for another. These things are quite fluid. So we see this when we are sleeping, as we talked about, but in the book I talk a little bit about some of the other factors in which we might have different varying levels of consciousness. So during sleep, for example, sometimes we have really vivid kind of content that we're semi-aware of, and other times we're almost completely catatonic, like we don't experience anything at all, right? So even sleep has its own kind of states as well, and maybe in other psychology classes you may cover them. There are like 4 different stages, and they also include REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep, and non-REM sleep. So sleep, you know, that's a different state of consciousness. We also have meditation. So there's lots of research that shows that meditation can change your awareness and change concentration. If you've taken Dr. Burwell's Buddhist and mindfulness psychology course, you probably learned quite a bit about that. One of my favorite findings of this was looking at different monks who, after practice, whenever they meditate, and they have them scanned in an MRI machine for something called DTI, or diffuser tensor imaging. It's a type of scan. So it's not actually measuring blood flow like a regular fMRI is, but it uses the same machinery, essentially. That monks, whenever they are, right after meditating, if you get a look at their DTI, which measures water flow, we see that it actually changes the direction of water flow for some of those individuals after meditating. So it does actually change what's going on in the brain. Hypnosis, tricky subject, because hypnosis, so much of what you find about hypnosis on social media or online is just bullshit, grifter stuff where people are trying to scam you into courses or whatever. And really, I think through the years, people, psychologists and researchers have kind of agreed that hypnosis is real, but it doesn't involve any kind of like magic or supernatural, or even all that strange mechanics. That generally speaking, hypnosis is a highly suggestible state. So you can kind of lure people into following instructions and being aware or unaware of certain things by putting them in this highly suggestible state. But even if it's not magic or whatever, it is a varying degree of consciousness, where sometimes people can be under hypnosis and be told something and have absolutely no memory of it during those times. And then finally we have drugs. Pretty self-explanatory that some drugs cause people, like, let's look back at this figure right here. The thing about drugs is that, like, I think a lot of times they don't make people experience profound thoughts. they merely make mundane thoughts feel profound, if that makes sense. So there's not a drug that's going to take you up here, which I don't know if you can see that because of my image up here. There's not one that's going to put you up here, that puts you into this highly vivid clarity of content. Instead, generally, instead what happens is usually, let me make sure I'm still recording after I hit that button. I am. Okay. What usually happens is that our impression is that it's more vivid than what we normally experience, or that that it's deeper or more profound than what we normally experience. But whenever you're smoking pot, it's just, it doesn't take you off this chart, for example. But it may make you go from very wakeful to drowsy, right? Or it may make, you take shrooms or something like that, and now you're not very aroused, but you have very high, vivid sensory experiences, or perceptual experiences, I should say. All right, so, and that's true for psychedelics, for hallucinogens, for uppers, downers, whatever. They do affect your consciousness. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these unconscious effects now. So we were talking about below the level of consciousness. Let's take a look at this example. How many F's do you see in this image? So take a quick second and tell me how many F's you see. Okay, this is an interesting example because it may not work for everybody, but it usually works when I show this in the classroom. That people will look at this and they will say, oh, there are 3 F's. And I'm like, okay, well, where are they? And they'll say, we got 1, we got 2, we got 3. There are the 3 F's. Cool, awesome. But there's actually more than that, right? So let's scan through. There's an F here, there's an F here, and there's an F here. So if you caught those on the first time, then this is not impressive at all. What I'm going to say is going out to the people who, like me, only saw 3 F's the first time you saw this. Why is it that we saw those 3 F's? It's partly because, it's partly because the words that we did not detect them are not super important, right? The word of, it's an article. So it's not a noun, it's not a verb or any kind of action-based, object or anything like that. It's simply a preposition, right? Which I guess kind of means that it is, optional. Well, I don't know. Depending, if you're a linguist, you may get mad when I say that. But basically, you're able to read this sentence, and if you didn't notice the F there, you probably still read the word of. It still registered to you. The sentence still made sense. So why is it that F was under your conscious awareness, but this one was not? Just an example of how sometimes these things that might seem mundane go under our awareness. So thinking about System 1 and System 2, which we're going to talk a little bit about, to talk about some what we do and don't notice, just to return back to this, what we saw is whenever we were just going with the first time we saw that, or the first time I saw this, counting those 3 F's, I was engaged with System 1, right? So System 1, mostly automatic. I'm not really stopping to check my math. I'm not really slowing myself down. I'm just kind of like looking at it and then just giving you the first thing off the top of my head. And it's not until System 2 where I stop and slow down and really kind of scan through that passage to look for it in order to find that specific F that I missed. So you may remember back in the decision-making chapter when we were talking about this, that's what Daniel Kahneman calls like the lazy system, because whenever we first go through this, it's not the one that pops up for it. Like, you have to wake up the System 2 in order to kind of, find those missing ones. So with System 1, we can say that generally a lot of System 1 things are under our level of awareness. That a lot of those things that happen are made without us really being aware of them. And System 2 is when we generally are aware of things. So if you want to think of this as kind of System 1 and System 2, you can. If you want to think about this in terms of like conscious versus non-conscious or below conscious, that's fine too. So an example of this is called processing fluency. And processing fluency is this notion that there are some ideas that we believe more than others, that we think are more accurate or more trustworthy than others. And we do that based on how easy they are to process. So this is an example of a largely unconscious phenomenon. So let me give you an example, as you can see here. And I'll come back to that slide for those of you that are worried that I didn't cover all those bullet points. If I were to ask you, like that you opened up your fridge and there were two boxes and they both had this note on there, those berries are poisonous versus those berries are poisonous, which of those warnings are you more likely to believe? Most people are going to choose this one right here. But why is that? Not everybody can put it into words, but they'll say it looks more official, whatever official means to you. And part of that is that this phrase over here, it says the same thing, but it's not as easy to read. It's in this kind of fake cursive a little bit. It's a little bit less familiar. It looks less, quote unquote, official. And so it's a little bit harder to process. Now, contrast these, right? So if you saw a note that looked like this, scribbly kind of handwriting, versus this over here, now I'm trusting this one more than the one on the left. And the reason why is because the one on the left, again, it doesn't look official, whatever official means. It doesn't really matter what that means, because what's happening is that our brain is putting up some resistance here. And that's very anthropomorphized way of talking about it, very mentalistic. But what I mean to say is that whenever our brain sees this right here, that it's very easy to access, very easy to analyze, because we can read it very easily. When we come across this one, we have to kind of stop a little bit and kind of think about what it is that we are reading. And because we have that resistance, there's an instinctual element of us that are a little more skeptical of this. And you've probably experienced this, I know I have, whenever I go to the doctor. And I go to the doctor and they write a prescription and they'll tell me like, hey, I'm writing you up with 7 days of penicillin or something like that. So take this to CVS and they'll give you your penicillin. So they hand me this note. And when I get to the car, I look at the prescription and I'm like, does that actually say penicillin? Or did she accidentally prescribe me, ibuprofen? Because this looks more like an I instead of a P, right? All of a sudden, I'm getting really kind of skeptical of this doctor whenever I wasn't at all before, merely because I can't really read their handwriting and I'm worried they made a mistake. And it's because it's hard for me to process that information. So if we want people to believe us, for the most part, the more straightforward we are, the easier it is to understand someone, the more accurate you think that they are, and the more trustworthy we think that they are. We see this all the time in politics, right? And in social media, where like if somebody's using a bunch of highfalutin language, if they're like, trying to be poetic or whatever, they got sentences that, run on for 20 seconds or whatever, we just assume that they're inauthentic. We assume that, that they're a shill or whatever, I don't know. But we kind of tune them out. It takes work to kind of keep up with some of that, some of that messaging, and so we don't really like that stuff. But we do like it whenever people are really straightforward, and I try to think about that when I make these videos, that I try to think like, if I can make this easy to access, then people will believe it, that they'll find it to be accurate and trustworthy, and they won't have to worry about, like double checking stuff. You can if you want to, obviously, but I want this to be an easy class to engage with. So you'll also see people take advantage of this. So like, for example, in the 90s, there was a very famous court trial which kind of hinged on this rhyme, which is that if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, right? And it's funny looking back, because like, even though it was like it's not funny because it's a murder case, but the idea was like, hey, if this glove doesn't fit, then this guy wasn't the killer. And they kept saying, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And it sounds really catchy, and there's a certain logic that like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It feels right. And it's not, the reason why it feels right is just because it's easy to access, it's easy to process. We have that processing fluency. So ideas that are easy to process, we tend to think are more accurate, we tend to think that they are more believable and more trustworthy. That's why, if you're like me and you have bad handwriting, you should maybe feel a little bit self-conscious about it, because other people are going to, without being aware of it, judge you a little bit for that. Okay, here's an example in social media that I wanted to show you because I think it's kind of a fun thing. And so this is an old study, and so this is back when it was Twitter. I'm not just being old, and I know it's called X or whatever. Get off my back. But this was back in the days of tweets and Twitters. So the question that was asked to participants was, how easy is it to understand this message versus how believable is this message, and how likely are you to share this message? So take a look at this. So, do you understand this message? Do you believe this message? Most people, when they look at this, say, yeah, I understand it. Sure, I believe it. What about this question? The morning after St. Patrick's Day is not going to be fun for anyone, and then the crying laughing emoji. Is this an understandable tweet? Yes, we understand the message. Is it believable? Well, we see the laughing face, so we kind of know that they're making a joke about being hungover or whatever, right? Now, what about this one? This mall is literally beautiful. I have to go sometime in my life. And then this kind of wary looking emoji. Is this understandable? Is this believable? Now, if you are like me, looking at these three, this one, I read through it, I got it. This one, I read through, and I got it. This one, when I read through, I stopped, and I kind of felt like I needed to reread it again, right? So I'm going to say it's not super easy to understand, and I'm not 100% trusting of whatever it's trying to express, right? There's some resistance here. I feel like I don't quite understand it, but why not? It's simple English, right? The only thing that's really different among these is the emoji and what the emoji is doing. And so in this particular study, what they look at is neutral messages, which you can see here in blue. This would be like a tweet that has no emoji on it. We can look at congruent messages, which is whenever, like this, the emoji is agreeing with this. It's a joke about people feeling hungover the day after after St. Patrick's Day. And then we have another group, the incongruent group, which is expressed in these white bars down here, which is whenever the emoji does not match the message. And so, looking at this, we see that whenever the emoji does not match the message, that people find it to be less understandable and less believable, even if they can't articulate exactly why. And we find that whenever the emoji is congruent, that there is a small little boost to understandability and believability. People tend to believe things more when there are emojis associated with it. They tend to believe, or they tend to assume that they understand the message better. They feel more confident in the message when it has an emoji by it, even if they can't say why. This is a study that I did with a student here at Westfield, and it's a very silly, fun study, very easy to do. And I mention this because the reason why, and I'm mentioning it at the end of the semester here, because this student, her name is Aleka Camp. It's not Aleka Camp anymore. She changed her last name because she got married. Congratulations, Aleka. But she, at the end of a class one day, was like, hey, I would want to do research. Do you want to do research? And I was like, sure. Like, what are you interested in? And she was interested in social media. I was not interested in the social media research, but I was interested in attention and thinking and memory. And so we put our heads together and we kind of came up with this nice little intersection here. And we made compromises, of course, because research is always about, what battles do you fight, which ones don't you? But the reason why I'm proud of this article is because it is like an example of like a student who is just interested in research, didn't have like an agenda, wasn't like trying to do it to like get into grad school. She was just interested, she was just curious. And we got this really cool article that was published in a cool journal, and if you want to check it out, you can too. It is freely available online. I almost assigned it for this class as reading, but I was like, nah, that's a little too. It's not narcissistic, but for some reason it feels a little bit like y'all would see that as narcissism. I already assigned my own textbook. It would feel weird to assign my own research. All right, so the reason why I'm covering this, though, is that this is an example of processing fluency. That whenever those emojis agree with the message, it makes the message easier to understand. It makes it more believable. That is an example of an unconscious bias that we might have. That we are biased to say that things that or maybe funny, for example, or more believable. I know, like, we see this all the time in media, right? Like, that, like, podcasts, every podcast has to be somewhat funny, even if it's, like, supposed to be, like, a political podcast or whatever, even if it's interviewing serious people. And what happens because it's funny is that people actually end up believing that stuff more than if it was, like, a really boring podcast, which is one of the reasons why the world is the way it is. Okay, let's talk a little bit about implicit biases, talking about ways that the world is the way it is. This is a really kind of controversial area. It's controversial for a couple of reasons. One, it's controversial, I would say, like in cultural context, because there's political beef that comes up with implicit biases that we can talk about a little bit. But it's also from a non-political standpoint, from a research standpoint, there are people who argue about this stuff in terms of how valid it is. So I don't do implicit bias research, so I don't really have like a super strong stake in this stuff. So if you hate this stuff, that's totally fine. I still think if you hate it, and this is true for I think almost everything. If you really hate something, like if you're like, oh, implicit biases, I'm so tired of hearing about implicit biases, then it is up to you to be able to articulate why, right? You can't just say like, oh, this is bogus because it's a bunch of like woke nonsense or whatever. You got to be able to say like, well, why is it bad? Why is it not fair? What is it about it that's not really working? That's not scientific, right? So if you find stuff interesting, cool. If you find it not interesting, that's cool too. I just need to know why. Does that make sense? So, and the reason why I'm being a little bit cagey about this is because sometimes you hear students say like, like in other, not in my class necessarily, but in other classes, that they'll be like, yeah, the professor didn't like, I got counted off on this exam because I didn't believe everything that the professor said. This is one of those cases where it's like, I'm totally okay with that. I just need to see your reasoning. You just need to show your work, The same like if you got a math problem, if we were doing math problems and you came up with a totally different answer from me, I'm going to call it wrong unless you can show me like, well, here's my math, and I can look at that math and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess you did do it right. It's just you didn't come to the same conclusion that I did. And that's totally fine. All right, maybe math not the best example there because usually in math there is only one answer. But anyways, you get the idea. I'm hemming and hawing to get into this because it's a controversial field, but I think that this shows also some of the effects of fluency in our below consciousness states of awareness. So we see this with implicit bias, where you have individuals who are implicitly biased toward and away from different groups. What does that mean? So let's say that like this is going to be like simple, non-controversial example. I like the Atlanta Braves. That is my baseball team. Grew up liking them because I'm from Georgia, and so I've always liked that baseball team. That is my sports team. So if I go outside and I see a group of people standing next to my mailbox, it's 3 people. I can't tell anything about them. I can, they all look adult height, but they're all 3 wearing Atlanta Braves jerseys. Versus if I see 3 people out there that are wearing Philadelphia Phillies jerseys, that's my blood rivals. How do you think I'm going to feel about those 2 different groups? If I'm looking at the people that are wearing the Braves outfits, I'm going to look out the window and I'm like, what are they doing there? Huh. Okay. I don't know. Maybe they're like lost, or I don't know. If I see Phillies, I'm going to look at them and I'm going to keep looking. I'm going to be like, what do they want? They think that nobody's home? Because I'm watching, I'm suspicious of these other people because they're just wearing a team that I don't like. So you could say that I am biased toward the Braves, but biased against the Phillies. So in this test, the implicit association test, the way that they measure these biases is by essentially looking for reaction times and looking at accuracy, like every other cognitive test that we've done this semester, right? Where basically you're going to respond how quickly things are associated. And it's going to throw up images where, like, if something is good, you're going to press A. If something is bad, you're going to press L. And so good is A, bad is L. And then you're going to see, like, if it's Braves, you press A. If it's Phillies, you press L. And so I'm looking at something like the word murder. And I know that's bad, so I'm going to press L. And it's really, really fast that I'm able to categorize that. And then I see something Philly related, and I press L. And because I associated, I'm supposed to be doing that. And so I build up this quick association of, like, Braves, good stuff, Phillies, bad stuff. And then halfway through the experiment, they reverse the contingencies so that now if it's bad or Braves, I have to press L. If it's good or Phillies, I have to press A. And what happens is that from that weird association, like, I know this key is good, but I'm responding to the Phillies now, there's a little bit of a slower reaction time. And this tells us that there is some kind of bias that I have against Philadelphia Phillies fans. And I'm so sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. If you're a Philadelphia Philly fan and you're watching this, turn it off, please. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But seriously, how come you're in New England? Like, why aren't you like a Red Sox person? I don't know, or a Mets fan or a Yankees fan. Why you gotta root for the Phillies? All right. But I'm using this non-controversially in this example, but you can easily see how this can extend to questions of racism, questions of sexism, or questions of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, because people will do this same kind of test. But instead of saying, if it's good, select this button, and if it's bad, select this button, and then if it's Braves versus Phillies, now they're going to do if it is somebody who is male versus female, or somebody who is straight versus queer, or somebody who is black versus white, or somebody who is, whatever, somebody who is heavy versus somebody who is lean, to look at any kind of potential implicit bias that you might have against that individual, or against the concept of that category. And again, I'll leave it up to you to decide, like, whether or not you find those differences in reaction time to be meaningful and to be relevant to the real world. That's just where that research comes from. So if anybody ever asks you about implicit biases, like if somebody says, because you'll see, like, people say, like, oh, I'm worried about police officers who have an implicit bias against people of color, right? And I know that's a stereotype, but, like, that's usually whenever people argue about implicit biases, it's usually about something like that, or about how, like, women are not seen as being in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And you can easily see how also this leads not just to stereotyping, but also to prototypes from when we talked about concept formation, and about how, like, well, whenever you think of a scientist and you close your eyes, what's the first thing to pop into mind, that might tell us about certain biases that we have. All right. So other interesting effects from priming. This is kind of just a fun example here. The Williams and Barr article. I already mentioned this a little bit, but it's an example of priming and how this behavior below consciousness can have effects on our behavior. In this particular case, what they did is they had people come in to take a study and to do an experiment, and they came into this waiting room. And in the waiting room, there's one other person. Now, this one other person is a paid actor. They're not actually there for part of the experiment, but they're saying that they're just there waiting. And so whenever you come in for your experiment, that individual who's paid to be there waiting, that you don't know about, they come up to you and they're like, hey, I have to run to the bathroom. Could you hold this cup for me? And they hand you a cup of coffee. And they go to that, and they come back, they get the coffee from you, then you go to the next room where you take a survey about your feelings of that person that was in the waiting room. What a twist, right? Now here's the kicker. Half of the people were given a cup of iced coffee, so the cup was quite cold. The other half were given a cup of hot coffee, so it was quite warm. And what they found is that the individuals that were given the warm coffee reported feeling socially closer and more trusting of those individuals than whenever they were handed iced coffee. So the only difference was that sensation on their hands from holding the coffee. But they made this implicit association classical conditioning, if you're a behaviorist, they made this implicit association that, oh, warmth is connected with this individual, or coldness is connected with this individual. So whenever the researchers asked, how likely do you think that individual was to donate to charity? If you were holding the warm cup, you'd be more likely to say they donated to charity than if they hold the cold cup, in which you'd say that they were less trustworthy and less likely to donate to charity. Some of these findings, this is priming research, which has come under fire, much like the implicit association research, as like some of it has been hard to replicate, which is extremely concerning. And so anytime you come across this kind of cool, fun research like this, that's using small differences in reaction time, always be skeptical. I think anytime you read research, period, you should always be skeptical. I think it's just good to be skeptical about incoming new information. But especially with this stuff, be a little bit on edge, because some of those studies have not replicated. So even if they do show these cool effects of priming, we should be careful with them. All right, we are now moving into some of the final topics of our semester here. Let's talk a little bit about the neuronal workspace. The only thing I really want to mention about this is that whenever people try to argue where consciousness takes place in the brain, it's tough to answer, because the truth is it happens all over the brain. But we can say that whenever people are trying to be aware of something visually or something auditorily, we see activation in what's called the global workspace, or sometimes called the neuronal workspace. And so global workspace theory is this idea that these areas of the brain that are active when we're processing things, that is our consciousness. So think about Baddeley and Hitch and their working memory model. If you remember that, you got like this one section for attention, and then beneath that you got like one module for vision, and then one for hearing. And so this kind of maps on to this global workspace theory idea, which is that whenever something is in our mind's eye, is really in our visual spatial sketchpad, like we talked about in that memory chapter. When we are thinking about how something sounds, when we're aware of that, we are processing that using our phonological loop, or the articulatory loop, from that section as well. All right, that's all that really want to mention about that. Really, that the global workspace theory about consciousness like that. Basically, what this means then is that the areas responsible for consciousness in the brain are going to be responsible also for working memory. It's also going to be responsible for creativity, so our ability to kind of create connections between stimuli and ideas. It's also going to be responsible for cognitive flexibility, so our ability to kind of shift in and out of different kinds of thought patterns. This is used a lot in to test like schizophrenia, for example, looking at cognitive flexibility, or dementia. People who have schizophrenia or have dementia generally have very low cognitive flexibility. The area of the brain that is responsible for this flexibility is the anterior cingulate gyrus, which is used also a lot in decision making as well. And it is heavily used in attention, which also highlights how this working memory model of the neuronal workspace and how they overlap, where attention is a key component of working memory, also a key component of our consciousness. Another really interesting piece about neuroimaging as it applies to consciousness, because again, the whole brain is used while we're conscious, but this is just kind of a cool finding that doesn't really fit anywhere else in our conversations this semester. That the default mode network is an area of the brain or it is a network of the brain that is constantly active. So generally speaking, no matter what you're thinking about, these areas are active. So you can see them here, that we have areas up front, in the middle in the back, and then on the sides in the back, which you can see right there. So all that right there, those areas are going to be active pretty much no matter what you're doing or thinking about. So what does that mean, right? People have speculated, and there's a lot of research in what they call resting state neuroimaging. So resting state is exactly what it sounds like, where you have somebody in a scanner and you just ask them to relax and you just scan their brain to see what's going on while the brain is not doing anything, quote unquote. And this is one of those areas that is always active when we are doing nothing. So some people argue that maybe this means that no matter what we're doing, if this is active, that maybe there's something about the default mode network that is responsible for our consciousness. So maybe it is active there, and that it helps us kind of regulate attention and be conscious and aware. And so there are some researchers who have argued the default mode network is kind of like one of the key networks, maybe one of 8 that are always active and always ongoing, that help kind of consolidate all the cognitive processes that are going on and making sure everything runs on time and doesn't degrade and stuff like that. And hey, maybe that's consciousness. But we also have seen how damage to the brain can lead to interesting or peculiar effects on consciousness. So now that we looked at neuroimaging, let's turn our attention to lesion studies. So use your interior cingulate to turn your attention over to lesion studies. So lesion studies are, we've talked about them almost every chapter, right? So where you damage the brain and you see how it affects the behavior, and then you draw the conclusion that because this happened, it must be because of this area of the brain. So we have seen examples of this. One of them is from the memory chapter, where we had H.M. and Clive Waring. Both of those guys destroyed their hippocampus and their medial temporal lobe, and after that they were unable to create conscious memories, but they were still able to create unconscious memories. So we can see that maybe something about the medial temporal lobe and hippocampus does something with regulating what we are and are not aware of in terms of memories, because the hippocampus is only going to consolidate memories that we are aware of. The memories that we are not aware of find other ways to the brain, as we talked about with implicit memories. Another example of this is blind sight. So here is a quick video that I want to show you of some researchers using blind sight, and it's going to combine a number of neuroimaging techniques that we've talked about this semester. So what you see right here, you know it's because he's got the crazy thinking cap on. This is EEG, so they're measuring the electrical activation throughout his brain, and behind this you're going to see a TMS wand, and TMS, as a reminder, is transcranial magnetic stimulation. So it essentially disrupts brain activation temporarily. So it creates a temporary lesion. So what they're doing is they are going to turn on and off this person's visual cortex. So they're going to make it so that he can and cannot see. This is from the National Science Foundation. So you can thank the American government for funding this research and these developments.
This brave soul is about to willingly and knowingly go blind. No, he hasn't lost his mind. He's taking part in an experiment that recreates blind sight.
Blind sight is a condition that some patients experience after having damage to the primary visual cortex in the back of their brains. What happens in these patients is they go cortically blind. They can't see any information in their visual world.
Well, no one is ever going to say blind sight is 20/20.
And because this is a slightly older video and it's got that cheesy guy narrating, you can expect a couple of more vision-related puns and jokes coming up that are very cheesy. So just warning about that. So he said that blind sight is not 20/20, but...
Neuroscientist Tony Rowe says it holds tantalizing clues to the architecture of the brain.
There are a lot of other areas of the brain that are involved with processing visual information, but without any visual awareness. So these other parts of the brain receive input from the eyes, but they're not allowing us to access it consciously.
Rowe is developing a clearer picture of how other parts of the brain, besides the visual cortex, respond to visual stimuli.
Click on the left, and if you see a diamond, click on the right.
That clicking is a powerful magnetic pulse being shot right into this man's visual cortex, disabling it and blinding him just for a fraction of a second.
That blindness occurs on the order of about 1/20th of a second or so.
Just as the pulse blinds him, a shape flashes onto a computer screen in front of him. Turns out 60 to nearly 100% of the time, test subjects report back the shape correctly.
They'll be at significantly above chance levels at discriminating those shapes, even though they're unaware of them. And sometimes they're nearly perfect at it.
In case you are concerned, the blindness wears off almost immediately, no lasting effects. But the findings are telling.
What this condition of blindsight tells us is that there are likely to be a lot of alternative visual pathways that go into the brain from our eyes that process information at unconscious levels.
Rowe says understanding and mapping those alternative pathways might be key to new rehabilitative therapies.
Currently, we have a lot of soldiers returning home who have brain damage to visual areas of the brain. We might be able to rehabilitate these patients.
And that's something worth looking into. For Science Nation.
Okay, all right. So in this case, what we just saw is somebody who was, so they were doing that task. All they had to do is, like, if it was one shape, click left. If it was another shape, click right. Very, very easy. You would expect accuracy should be 100%, right? But it happens extremely fast, and, you know, a 20th of a second. And they had that hooked up to the TMS device, so that right after, you know, or right before it was presented, they zapped them with that. And even though those individuals couldn't tell you, like, yes, I saw something, so they were functionally blind, they still, more than chance, got it correct. So what does that mean? It means that they were able to process and recognize and discriminate those shapes totally without awareness, totally without being aware they had actually even seen something. There's another kind of, and I couldn't find a video version of this particular example here, but this has also been done with other people who have blind sight. So this is somebody who actually had it through actual brain damage. It wasn't just that they had a TMS device being done. So this individual had damage to their primary visual cortex, and so she was functionally blind, legally blind. She's not able to drive a car, and, you know, not able to walk without the help of a seeing eye dog and cane. But her eyes are totally fine. And given a task like this, where she has like a small envelope, and she has to place that envelope into a slot like this that changes depending on the trial, here's what we see. That for somebody who has blind sight, or sorry, let's look at this one right here first, this comparison. This is like the control condition. In the control condition, basically, people are great at this. They can easily throw it in, put it in just fine. What happens whenever you give that to somebody with blind sight? So even though they can't tell you they see anything, you can see here that they're either trying to do it straight up and down, or trying to do it so perpendicular to how it's supposed to be, or perfectly like it's supposed to be. And then whenever they're actually putting it in, they're putting it in exactly as it's supposed to be. They even tried this, you know, with different orientations. They're just showing the 0 degree one right here. So even though this individual is unaware of the slot in front of them, they were able to correctly guess pretty much each time without being aware of it. And then finally, we got split brain research. So you know, we've already talked about this a couple of times, so I'm not going to talk about that again in too much detail. But if you remember, split brain is whenever the corpus callosum is severed, so that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere cannot communicate with each other. And what happens is that if you show somebody like that a stimulus in their in their left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere, the individual will not be able to tell you what they saw, but they could show you by like drawing it with their left hand, with, I guess that would be with their right hand. No, that would be with their left hand. And so in that case, they're not aware of what they saw, but they're still able to act on it, they're still able to behave on it. And so again, this shows us that consciousness is not something that is easily located in one singular part of our brain, that it's spread out and it's very complicated and it adapts, and it really depends on what kinds of questions you're asking, what modality you're asking it in, what time of day, all these things. All right. The final thing I want to mention here is, because we were talking about split brain research, this brings us back full circle to Michael Gazzaniga. Michael Gazzaniga was the researcher who he and his mentor Roger Sperry, they pioneered this research, and then after Gazzaniga kind of grew up and became his own researcher, because he was kind of a trainee of Sperry at first, when he started doing his own thing, really got interested in free will, really, and because he was really interested. Like, Gazzaniga was stuck on this idea of like, okay, well, how is it that we can make decisions about things and not be aware of them? Does that mean that the left hemisphere, which kind of explains things, because that's where language is, shout out chapter 10, because of all that, like, what does that mean about our ability to choose to do what we want to do? We're not always aware of what we want to do. So what does that mean about free will? And that brings us now to this question of who is in charge, which is a clever subtitle, because that is the title of Michael Gazzaniga's book that he wrote about this subject. So there's a really interesting study by Benjamin Libet from the 80s, and he did this with EEG. So he got people that have one of those skull caps on, and the task was extremely easy. Basically, we want you to just relax, and whenever you want to, just flick your wrist. So just flick your wrist whenever you want to, but tell us when you decide to. So as soon as you feel it, comment on it, and then do it. So that's all it was. During that time, they're also measuring their EEG, and what they found is, which you can see right here, time is the x-axis, that individuals have something going on in their brain, and that's what you're looking at with this blue line right here. So let's trace it through and see what happens. So we can see it basically stays at 0, it starts to raise up, gets to this highest point, and then depolarizes and goes down. So pretty typical kind of, looks like a pretty typical action potential kind of, or hyperpolarization, ERP. But what's actually happening here is that this line is when they flexed, this line is when they talked, and as you can see, before that even happened, what the heck is this? Right? So they're talking when they get the urge to flick their wrist. We can see where they flick their wrist, but we can see that signal changes before they become aware of their intention to act. So people showed activity about 550 milliseconds before the action occurred, but they reported that happening 200 milliseconds before it occurred, which means that there's this 300 milliseconds where, like, well, what's happening here? This is really interesting, right? Because what this means is that if this person is choosing when they flick their wrist, that their brain seems to have known before they knew. Think about that for a second, right? That they were going to flick their wrist before they were aware that they were going to flick their wrist. So this started a lot of research in the 80s about, like, okay, well, what does it mean to be voluntary? What does it mean for you to commit an action? What's going on in this space right here? What does this mean about free will? So when we talk about free will, this is, a conversation from philosophy that, if you're not familiar with it, that basically, like, that free will means that you do what you want, right? That the things that you do are because you chose to do them. So you watching this video, that is because you have free will, and you decided that you wanted to watch this video. And this has become an extremely complicated field of research, not just for philosophy, but also for psychology. Because what we know is that things from our past have a huge influence on our present. So, for example, I got really sick eating pickles whenever I was a kid, and after that, whenever I would smell pickles, I would feel sick to my stomach, and so I did not eat pickles for a really long time. So, did I not eat pickles because of free will, because I chose not to eat pickles? Or did I not eat pickles because I had this association that was created that then changed my responses later in the future? It's a slightly different way of looking at things, right? And this finding right here throws things further into confusing territory, because what this shows is that even when we feel like we're free to flick our wrist, which is basically like the most free thing that you can do. If you want to, you can flick your wrist if you want to. If you don't have to, but it's like, it's super easy to do. You can do it spontaneously. It feels random. And what this data shows is that it's not random. That before we even get this notion that we want to flick our wrist, that something happens in the brain, there's a change that occurs, that there's a process that is starting before we are even aware of it. So what does this mean about unconscious processes? When we talk about free will, do they count as an example of free will, of you choosing what to do even if you aren't aware of it? Can you make a choice if you're not conscious? I don't really think that you can, right? Like, that doesn't sit well with me, that you can make a choice and not be aware that you're making a choice. It feels like then it's not really a choice. And if that's true, then that means that maybe there's not free will. And if that's true, then what does that mean? According to Michael Gazzaniga, just like the studies that we just saw, Michael Gazzaniga argues that we essentially, and I wrote about this a little bit at the very end of our book, that basically we, according to Gazzaniga, act very much based on prior conditioning and reflexes and associations, and that the left hemisphere of our brain, where language is located, interprets all of that. It interprets our behaviors and essentially tells us a story about why we did things. It makes the world make sense to us. So why did you walk downstairs and make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Oh, because you like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and you remembered that there was food there, right? And so according to Gazzaniga, this question of free will is really, really messy, because you might have chosen to go downstairs, but that choice was already made before you were aware of it. And if that's the case, then it's not exactly a choice. It means that you were kind of acting like Pavlov's dogs, which brings us back to behaviorism. That maybe what we are doing is really like a computer, really like a machine, like cognitive psychologists have been arguing, which is that, we follow a set of protocols and procedures that our brain have, and we can go on autopilot. But the really interesting thing is that we don't feel like it's autopilot. That our brain works really hard to make us all feel like we're in charge. It works really hard to make us feel like, no, we went downstairs to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich because we wanted to, not because we, had this prior conditioning that, like, when we've been hungry, we go downstairs and make food for ourselves. And then that kind of makes me wonder about, well, what is it that when we're thinking about stuff, so even if we're not acting on stuff, if we're just thinking about thoughts, are you in control of your own thoughts? So whenever you open up Instagram or TikTok and that algorithm shows you that first video, you're telling me that you decided what to think about? Because to me, from my point of view, it really looks like your phone decided what you're going to be thinking about, right? If the first thing that you open up is like it shows you something, maybe it's news, maybe it's a headline, maybe it's like a distracting video, maybe it's all the above. But to me, in that case, it doesn't really feel like you chose what to think about. It feels like something else chose what you're thinking about. And if we know that our behavior changes based on what we're thinking, then how can you argue that things like social media or things like what you see online, that stuff isn't changing your behavior? And if it is changing your behavior, then who's actually in charge, right? Where's that free will begin and end? I wish I had answers for that, but I don't. And actually, I don't know if I do wish I had answers about that, because I think that this struggle thinking about this, I don't think that we're going to solve this in our lifetimes. I think that this is one of those problems that really kind of depends on how you kind of set up the argument, how you frame it. Because somebody who is another way to think about it, maybe you're sitting back and you're like, no, I believe in free will because I have a spirit, and whatever religious belief system you have, you're like, and so I know that my choices are mine, and if I do good, it's going to result in this outcome. If I do bad, it's going to result in this outcome, and that's why I behave the way that I behave. It is free will. But then you start looking at those religious systems, and it's like, okay, well, if this figure is all powerful, then don't they know if you're gonna be going to the good place or going to the bad place beforehand? And if that's the case, do you have free will? I don't know. It's a really interesting thing to think about, and you can see how, hopefully, how so much of what we talked about from the very beginning of our class, from talking about the differences between behaviorists and cognitive psychologists and all of that, how all of that really wraps itself up in talking about consciousness and what it means to be a person, what it means to make decisions, what it means to make choices, if we have any choices to make at all. I don't know. And I'm gonna end the class on that phrase. I don't know, because you can learn about this stuff all your life, and there's still so much left to learn. And I don't think that's an intimidating thing. I don't think it's a frustrating thing. I think that's an amazing thing. And it means that it gives you something to do, gives us purpose, it gives us meaning. That for some of us, that meaning is trying to find the answers, and that sometimes by scratching at the answers we find even more interesting questions that we didn't even know existed. We weren't aware of those questions. Those questions were below our consciousness, but they were there the whole time and may have had some impact on us, and we just didn't know it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for following me on this journey. If you have any feedback about the class or about the video, I'm not going to get upset if you leave it in the comments, because I'm going to re-record these in a number of years anyways, and try to make it better each time. This is like the 5th time I've recorded videos for this class, but the first time that I've done it this way. So thanks so much for following me on this journey, and I will talk to you later. Have a great life. Bye.